This video was made possible by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you for your support. There are many things I love about Disney, but the center of the company for me will always be Howard Ashman. As a creative force, he completely changed the direction of the company during one of its darkest moments. After Walt Disney died, the animation studio was failing, and Ashman would bring the company back to its roots. With his extensive background in theater, he would tap into the history of the Disney animated musical and bring it back to the company. Alongside composer Menken, the duo sparked what's now called the Disney Renaissance with their work on The Little Mermaid, which was critically acclaimed as a return to form for the company. But I've told that story before. I've already made many videos talking about Ashman's work with Disney and its long-lasting impact. But there's a lot I haven't talked about that happened before that. You see, while Disney was struggling after the death of their founder and creative leader, Howard Ashman and Menken were refining their craft.
I was exclusively a composer lyricist, and I get a call from Maury Yeston. Howard, there's this guy, Howard Ashman, who has the rights to do a Vonnegut novel, but he wants to write the lyrics. Would you be interested? I thought, sure, I'll help him out. Why not? I'll meet with him. Make a long story short, Howard and I got together then and wrote God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater.
God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater featured a surreal mix of tragedy and humor, telling the story of a World War II veteran trying to reconcile with his traumatic past. And the music matched the hectic, unpredictable, and absurd nature of the story.
But they need a whole Velveeta. But they haven't. I wish I was dead.
After premiering at the WPA Theater in New York City, the same theater that Howard Ashman had taken over with his then boyfriend Stuart White, the show transferred to Off-Broadway and even had a run in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, it had mixed reviews in the New York Times, and with a cast of 14 people, it wasn't likely to find the type of budget it would need to continue. But this failure seemed to inspire Howard Ashman, and in response, he wanted the next musical he worked on to be something truly unforgettable.
I decided that the next thing I did was going to be something attention-grabbing with a cast of not more than 8 people, and also that it would have some sort of large gimmick sitting in the middle of it so that people would have to notice.
So Ashman and Menken started developing their next show, a musical take on a cult film that Ashman had seen on TV as a teenager. Not only would it become a musical theater classic, but it would also set the stage for the rest of their career. And though it isn't technically a Disney show, it's impossible to fully understand their later work without it. Little Shop of Horrors premiered on May 6, 1982. As an adaptation of the 1960 movie of the same name, the musical tells the story of Seymour, a florist's assistant who mysteriously comes into possession of what appears to be a strange plant with a taste for blood. He names it after his crush Audrey, who works at the same flower shop and is in an abusive relationship with a sadistic, leather-wearing dentist. As the plant grows larger, it demands more and more blood from Seymour and eventually convinces him to kill people, with the murders increasing in intensity until it's revealed that the plant is actually an alien that wants to take over the world. The show ends with the plant eating Seymour and a final number about how you shouldn't feed the plants. Howard Ashman first saw the film late at night on TV when he was 14. It was definitely an unlikely contender for the stage. It was a low-budget, tongue-in-cheek movie that was filmed over the course of 2 days. It had a literary basis and also a cult following, but it was a B-movie, basically a type of film that was low-budget and meant to be shown before a bigger film in a double feature. People remembered it as a funny movie, but not something to really take seriously. But Howard saw so much more in it, and so he started adapting it for the stage. There were a few differences between the movie and the musical. For example, in the stage show, Seymour's first kill is the dentist, while in the movie, it was a homeless man. Also, the plant Audrey 2 is technically an alien in the musical, while in the original, it was just a crossbred plant. And most notably, Ashman saw Faust in the story. The German folk legend about a man unsatisfied with his life making a deal with the devil had become common in literature by this point. But recognizing that trope at the heart of Little Shop, allowed Ashman to tap into a sense of earnesty and humanity that many wouldn't have thought of while watching the campy comedic original film. Little Shop of Horrors satirizes many things: science fiction, B-movies, musical comedy itself, and the Faust legend. There will, therefore, be a temptation to play it for camp and low comedy. This is a great and potentially fatal mistake. The script keeps its tongue firmly in cheek, so the actors should not. Instead, they should play with simplicity, honesty, and sweetness, even when events are at their most outlandish. The show's individual quote-unquote style will evolve naturally from the words themselves and an approach to acting and singing them that is almost childlike in its sincerity and intensity. So, Ashman started collaborating with Alan Menken again, and the musical began to take shape. Menken's background as a singer-songwriter and his interest in rock, blues, and R&B ended up fitting the show perfectly. It was set in the 60s, so the soundtrack has a lot of influence from pop music of the time. The Alien Plant has a blues-influenced musical style that Menken has said was inspired by Howlin' Wolf.
Need me more, need me all night long.
And the narrators of the show are each named after girl groups of the time, and the music that they sing takes from that as well. The narrators are also a Greek chorus, a trope dating back to ancient Greek theater, where a chorus would comment on the action taking place. After premiering at the WPA Theater, it quickly became a success and eventually transferred to Off-Broadway. It was an incredibly unique show. It effortlessly combined monster movies, pop music, and comedy in a way that just hadn't been seen before. It followed in the tradition of other subversive cult musicals that were influential in the New York theater scene, like the English translation of Threepenny Opera, featuring topics that were unconventional for theater of the time. But just as much as it subverts tradition, Little Shop also embraces it.
This is what I want to find out. Yeah. Why did this man say you're a trailblazer? What did you do that really nobody had done before?
Personally, I didn't do anything. There's a history in New York of off-Broadway musicals. I guess it goes back to Threepenny Opera at the Theater de Lis in the mid-50s. And then there's Dames at Sea, which I was trying to write the Dames at Sea of horror movies when I wrote Little Shop. I was patterning myself after a kind of form and genre. Little Shop of Horrors is very deliberately a conventional American musical comedy. In fact, it's parodying American musical comedy.
Howard Ashman was very direct about wanting to use songs to drive the story forward. And just like a lot of traditional musicals, Little Shop is very earnest and has heartfelt moments. But it also seems acutely aware of the absurdity of musical theater, how random and silly it can seem to just break out into song, and it turns this self-awareness into comedy. For example, in the song Dentist, Oren talks about how he got into dentistry, specifically about how his mom thought he'd be a good fit for it after he tortured animals as a child. He's also addicted to laughing gas and enjoys torturing other people under the guise of dentistry. And, of course, it's set to a catchy, beautiful, and funny Phil Spector girl group-inspired arrangement.
Jobii, a dentist.
And this song becomes even funnier when you consider the story behind the character and his later demise from laughing gas.
Howard and I were trying to figure out how Seymour would commit the first murder, because in the movie, Seymour just throws a bottle in and hits a bum in the head. My dad, growing up, was president of the New York chapter of the American Analgesia Society, a society of dentists that promote the use of nitrous oxide as safe. So I thought, wouldn't it be funny if Oren actually liked to give himself the nitrous oxide and he gets the mask stuck and he asphyxiates himself. As I always do with my shows, I would give them a cassette of the show that I had written and say, oh, you want to hear my new score. So I get a call on the answering machine from my mother. Hi, Alan, it's Mom. We heard the tape. Okay. Click. And Janet said, oh, I think she's just so moved. I said, no, I don't think so. So I called. I said, well, how would you feel if you devoted your life to promoting nitrous oxide as safe and your son writes the show, which is somewhere left?
But the music wasn't always rock, blues, and R&B inspired. When they first started writing the show, the duo had a much different approach that wasn't very well received.
When it's time to pick a pet flower, who's the shrub we love? Who's our potted plant of the hour? Who's our bush when push comes to shove?
Anyway, the direction was changed and history was made. The music for Little Shop of Horrors is truly fantastic and has a ton of variety. Possibly the most endearing part about this show is that throughout all of the chaos and comedy, it has an incredibly earnest love story at the center, and both Audrey and Seymour have their own ambitions for leading a better life. My personal favorite song from the show is Somewhere That's Green, the song that Audrey sings in the first act, dreaming of a simpler life in the suburbs.
A matchbox of our own, a fence, a real chain link, a grill out on the patio, disposal in the sink.
On the surface, it might seem funny. Since set in the 60s, she's wishing for things that once seemed revolutionary but now seem passé. But when combined with the melody, this song is just so ridiculously gorgeous.
Washer and a dryer and an ironing machine in a tract house that we share somewhere that's green.
Audrey is the woman in an abusive relationship, just trying to get by in her life on Skid Row. And part of what gets her through the day is dreaming of the future, picturing a place where she can feel safe and loved. And as I mentioned earlier, this show plays with and subverts a lot of musical theater tropes, but this song embraces them more directly. As Ashman would later describe when talking about the I Want song trope, Somewhere That's Green follows a tradition.
The second number is the one where the girl sits on the trash can and sings about what she wants, like Eliza Doolittle did once on a time, and Fiona whatever her name is in Brigadoon. Women have been doing that in musicals for years. The difference is that our girl, Audrey, is singing about a toaster and a tract house and a garbage disposal instead of a castle in the sky somewhere.
This is an incredibly beautiful song that shows the heart of the musical. And just like Audrey, Seymour also wants a happy ending and to get out of Skid Row, which makes the actual story even more tragic. When she begs Seymour to feed her to Audrey too, after it attacked her, causing a slow death, he complies. Spend all day picking apart the show and talking about my favorite moments, but one of the most interesting things to me is how Little Shop set the stage for Howard Ashman and Alan Menken's later work with Disney. But we still have a little way to go before we get there. The musical was a complete success and was eventually made into a movie, and the ending was changed to make it more palatable to mainstream audiences, instead giving Seymour and Audrey a proper and surreal happy ending. There was another ending filmed that featured Audrey 2 taking over the world, but after doing poorly in test screenings, they replaced it with the happy ending, and the original one would remain unreleased until the 2000s. And despite the producers wanting to take the show to Broadway, Ashman was insistent that it stayed in smaller, more intimate theaters. At the time, Broadway had had some unconventional hits, but it was largely rooted in more traditional musical theater, and a monster horror musical might not have done so well. But that didn't stop Ashman himself from going to Broadway. In 1986, he opened the show Smile, a musical he wrote with Broadway legend Marvin Hamlisch about a California beauty pageant.
It's been 6 years since Marvin Hamlisch's last hit on Broadway, in a business where you're only as good as your last hit. Marvin Hamlisch's collaborator, Howard Ashman, can afford a mistake even less than Hamlisch. He's the lyricist, writer, and the director of Smile, and though he's had a hit musical off-Broadway, this is his first and maybe his only shot at the big time.
People having careers like mine just don't get to do this very often.
Is it a hit?
Who knows?
Unfortunately, Smile was a failure. It closed after only 48 performances, and though Hamlisch and Ashman would revise it for others to perform later, its potential to be a hit was already squashed. Howard felt very discouraged after this, as it was a substantial flop in the middle of his blossoming career. But he always seemed to find a way to keep going. So when he later received a call from Jeffrey Katzenberg, then studio chairman of Disney, he jumped at the opportunity. Jeffrey was recommended Howard by his friend David Geffen, who was one of the producers for Little Shop. And coincidentally, Howard actually already had a history with Disney. Earlier in his career, he worked on the new Mickey Mouse Club book. And also, though it wasn't an official collaboration, there was a song about Disneyland in Smile. And the movie version of Somewhere That's Green appears to reference Disney's Snow White. But anyway, Ashman wrote lyrics for the opening song to Oliver and Company, and afterwards worked on a screenplay for a Tina Turner biopic. But he was more interested in animation, and when he was later given a few options for future projects, he settled on an adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. The studio wanted their next feature to be a musical, but Ashman had even more specific ideas. He wanted to not only completely revive the Disney animated musical, but also bring it closer to the tradition of musical theater. And when Disney asked him who he wanted to work with, he recommended Alan Menken. So they started work on The Little Mermaid, and the film was so successful it completely changed the trajectory of Disney forever. And though Little Shop isn't a Disney musical, it has a lot to do with that legacy. Howard Ashman was always very specific about wanting each song in a show to drive the story forward in some way. That wasn't always the case in musical theater, before the format of the book musical became popular. In other words, before having specific stories interwoven with songs became the default. It was actually quite common for shows to just have songs that were entertaining and not much else. And since Disney musicals sometimes reflected musical theater of the day, they had similar sequences. Not all songs in the early movies were like that, but some were more important to the story than others. In contrast, Little Shop of Horrors puts storytelling at the forefront while also having incredibly entertaining songs. That can be a difficult thing to do, and Howard Ashman and Alan Menken were just perfect for the job. And when beginning work on The Little Mermaid, it seems like they were intent on bringing the format of Little Shop with them and strengthening the link between Disney animated movies and musical theater of the time.
Howard had very strong feelings about making sure that we were always driving story forward and always stylistically rooted in a world. And for me, Little Mermaid is our sequel to Little Shop of Horrors as much as it is our debut with Disney. It was very much in the same musical theater mold as Little Shop of Horrors.
In fact, Somewhere That's Green shares quite a bit with Part of Your World, Ariel's famous I Want song.
Far from Scootaloo, I dream we'll go somewhere that's green. Out of the sea, wish I could be part of that world.
While writing Part of Your World, the duo referred to it as Somewhere That's Wet because of how similar it is. Even aside from the melodic nods, Part of Your World feels like an evolution. Ariel wants similar things to Audrey, a place where she can be who she wants to be and feel truly at home. Oh, also, on the topic of Ashman's earlier work, Ariel was played by Jodie Benson, who had previously starred in Smile. Little Shop was also the reason why The Little Mermaid was Alan Menken's first ever score.
We had the experience with Little Shop of Horrors when it became a film. I remember we got a nomination for Best Score, Golden Globes. I said, wow, and who? It's great. Yeah, but it's not you. It's a wonderful writer, Miles Goodman. Miles Goodman had written basically 8 minutes of musical sort of transition, and I wasn't eligible because everything I had written had been written for the stage. We did, however, get a Best Song nomination, which was, for Oscar, which was great for Mean Green Mother. But when it came time to do Little Mermaid, Howard said, you have to write the score. And I said, I don't know how to write a score. He said, well, you'll figure it out.
Earlier I mentioned that Howard compared Little Shop to other subversive musicals in New York history, specifically the Threepenny Opera. Though it didn't seem to affect the music of the show, this reference would come back later. Alan Menken has said that the song Poor Unfortunate Souls from Little Mermaid was influenced by the Threepenny Opera, and I think it specifically references Pirate Jenny.
You gentlemen can watch while I'm scrubbing the floors. I admit that in the past I've been a nasty.
Another interesting detail about Little Shop is the portrayal of the dentist. In the musical, Ashman and Menken give him more of an explicitly coded aesthetic, one that references leather sort of motorcycle BDSM subcultures, and Ashman apparently based this off of trade, which is a complicated word in the queer community that has many different meanings, but in this situation it refers to gay men who can pass as straight with a very strong type of masculinity. And this same type of coding was used for Gaston in Beauty and the Beast. I'll tell you one other thing that's for sure. I'm not saying Howard Ashman liked rough trade, but Alan told me that both the dentist in Little Shop of Horrors and Gaston were based on, trade. So the uber-masculine Gaston, with his bulging muscles and hairy chest, was the kind of man Ashman fantasized about? Yeah, or had been with, says Condon. Not the brightest, but lovely, That's a gay joke. That's a gay inside joke, that character, Gaston. Others were in on it as well. Andreas Deha, also an openly gay man, was the supervising animator for Gaston, and has said that he studied men at an LA gym while working on the character. And Don Hahn, producer of Beauty and the Beast, got him a subscription for Muscle and Fitness magazine while working on the movie. And that whole rough trade joke started with Little Shop. So it's easy now to see how the show affected many parts of their work with Disney, not just The Little Mermaid. And in terms of Beauty and the Beast, when listening to the opening number Belle, it's hard not to think about the song Skid Row. There are many things that are similar between these two songs. For example, the way in which characters are introduced with their own solos, how Belle and Seymour both have their own musical motifs, while characters like Gaston and Audrey are introduced with the main melody. And with the entire setting being established by the ensemble, they just both feel like very similar songs. And if Alan Menken said that they were using parts of Little Shop's format for The Little Mermaid, it doesn't seem far off to me to think that it would seep into their other work as well. Also, while we're talking about Skid Row, I just want to highlight how it's one of my favorite songs in all of Little Shop. Its lyrics communicate the anger and frustration that the characters on Skid Row feel. They feel left behind by society, and the music and lyrics really put you in their position. Uptown you cater to a million jerks. Uptown your messengers and mailroom clerks. Eating all your lunches at the hot dog carts. But bosses take your money and they break your hearts. Another link between the show and Disney movies is that when working on Hercules, director John Musker explained the origin behind the film's gospel choir and how that related to Little Shop. Specifically, when the studio was working on The Little Mermaid, they visited New York and Howard Ashman recommended they seek the gospel at Clonis, which retold the tragedy of Oedipus by using gospel music and a choir to function like the trope of a Greek chorus. This inspired them to try a similar thing for Hercules, but Alan Menken was also working on the movie and had some concerns. Howard had, of course, used a black girl group as a sort of Greek chorus in Little Shop. Because of this, Alan Menken, when we pitched him the idea for our approach, was concerned. He feared it might appear too derivative. Whether or not I was in denial, I don't know. But I felt we could do this in a way that didn't duplicate Little Shop. A gospel approach to the music seemed to make the movie more fun and accessible. So, almost a decade later, Little Shop was still having an impact on Disney. Though Howard Ashman had passed away due to AIDS-related complications a few years prior, the influence of the work he did with Alan Menken was still alive. And it still lives on to this day. Since it premiered, Little Shop has firmly cemented its place in the musical theater canon. It's a popular choice among community theaters and high schools around the US due to its small cast and a thrilling story, but it's still goofy enough to not be outright disturbing. And because of that, it's also had an unexpected life as a hit among families as well.
When we wrote Little Shop of Horrors, I thought, oh, kids can't come to this because it's scary. There's a big plant and it's eating people and it's all this blood. Kids love it. There's no one more enthusiastic than kids.
Little Shop of Horrors has also held a specific significance in the queer community. Like a lot of Howard Ashman's work, many people see themselves in the theme of wanting to belong. And his I Want songs in particular show a distinct sense of longing that many queer people can empathize with. Audrey's dream of being a normal housewife might come off as an odd ambition in a world where women aren't bound to patriarchal gender roles. But to many trans women, that's aspirational. They want the agency to choose the life they want to live, and that's fine, even if it reflects a patriarchal tradition. When queer people are often rejected and inherently placed on the fringes of society, sometimes it can be liberating to be quote-unquote normal. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both her and Seymour have become icons in the trans community. Between Seymour's meekness and Audrey's cheery, desperate passivity, they have a respective masculinity and femininity that the world hates and rejects. Specifically, I feel like so many trans women I know have an attachment to Audrey, who so firmly and resolutely doesn't believe she can ever be loved, who takes her abusive and shitty relationship with Oren, the sadistic dentist, as inevitable. And the world of the movie makes fun of Audrey as fake, dolled up, put on, stupid, vapid, vain. But the movie and Seymour love her for who she is in a very real way. This is, of course, analyzing the show from a particular perspective, but it is interesting how certain interpretations of the show have brought out this quality. In the Pasadena Playhouse production of Little Shop from a few years ago, Michaela J. Rodriguez, a trans woman, played Audrey, and certain lines suddenly had more layers of meaning.
You don't need no makeup, don't have to pretend. The girl that's inside you.
These feelings related to gender are of course not unique to trans experience, but the ways in which they've resonated specifically with trans people shows just one of the many ways that Little Shop has impacted audiences. And it's influenced more than just the US. The show has become a musical theater staple internationally.
It is eating me alive. Alan just escaped from the Jaws a few months ago, but I had to stage the New York production, then the Los Angeles production, then this production, and I'm going home to write the screenplay, and I'm training people to do the Australian productions and the South African production and the Israeli production and this one and that one, and we just talked about Mexico yesterday. It's running in Norway right now, and I'm going to cross a fjord on, October 24th to go and see Audrey 2. Somewhere, I can't even pronounce the city.
Little Shop has been performed in many different countries and languages. And in Germany, since it premiered in 1986, it's actually become one of the most performed musicals in the country that doesn't have a fixed venue. I've seen productions of Little Shop in Germany that each interpret the show differently, and I think that brings to the forefront an important topic to discuss when looking at the show: whitewashing. Basically, this means to cast white people as characters either traditionally played by or specified to be people of color. Whitewashing usurps voices from marginalized people and further contributes to their marginalization and erasure, making sure that white voices and faces are the center of the conversation. These are not those who were just quote-unquote looking to be offended. These are those who are trying to call their erasure into attention, those with already limited visibility in the media or control over their own narratives. In the original script for Little Shop, the characters Crystal, Ronette, and Chiffon are specified to be black, though if you license the show through Musical Theater International, they say that the original character descriptions are not meant to restrict the way in which licensees stage or cast their productions of the show. Rather, they are an insight into how that production was presented. That being said, the site still says that, while anyone is technically allowed to play any role in the show, in casting your show, an inclusive approach is suggested. They also encourage the roles of Crystal, Ronette, and Chiffon to be played by actors of color. I've seen productions of the show that do not follow these recommendations, and in a show like Little Shop that pays so much tribute to specifically Black US American musical traditions, I think whitewashing it is just disrespectful and removes a lot of context from the show. For example, in the original production and film, Audrey was white, and in Somewhere That's Green, she's talking to characters who are black about her fantasy to live in the suburbs, and she specifically references Levittown, a place infamous for its racist pro-segregation policies. It's in this moment that it becomes clear that what Audrey sees as fancy, as safe, isn't the case for everyone. But that's just one reading. Audrey is not specified to be white in the script, and there are many productions where she isn't, changing the meaning of that subtext. Her romanticizing something she probably doesn't know much about makes it all the more complicated, and I don't think empathizing with her longing to be in a loving relationship necessarily has to contend with all of that nuance. But it's just one example of an important detail to talk about when looking at the show: In a world where people of color are not only discriminated against, but have also been the subjects of ridicule through racist traditions like minstrel shows, it's clear that theater does not exist in a vacuum, which is why many people advocate for color-conscious casting when casting roles, keeping anti-racism in mind. I once saw a production in Germany that on the night that I saw it had an all-white cast, and that affected the show. For example, the old Chinese man who sells Audrey 2, a character who's already been criticized throughout the years for playing into Orientalist stereotypes, was played this time by a white man. And I feel like he added a whole other layer of offensive Orientalist tropes that reminded me of just one of the ways in which whitewashing can perpetuate racism. When bringing up whitewashing and Little Shop, I've seen fellow white people get defensive, ignoring the fact that Musical Theatre International is merely asking theaters to have inclusive casting. And if a production is not willing to reckon with these questions, think about why a show is written a certain way and how they can be inclusive with their casting, then I have to wonder, why are you even doing the show in the first place? Why not just do a different show? This is also an issue in many other countries, including the US. Whitewashing Little Shop has been a conversation in many different places. And I'm bringing this up because I think it's an important discussion when talking about this show's legacy, and it's unavoidable when talking about international productions. That being said, let's go back to Germany, because when looking at international versions of the show, how it's translated can really change a lot. And Little Shop was translated by Michael Kunze, who has a prolific career filled with original shows, as well as many translations of US American ones, including 2 from Disney. There are more fancy ways of talking about it in linguistics, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say that you can translate things literally or emotionally. You can either say exactly what it says, almost word for word, or you can translate the general sentiment. Sometimes one way is better than the other, but you'll often just see a mixture of the two. There are, of course, a lot of other factors, such as rhymes often have to change and slang will be different, but it's hard to explain those thoroughly unless you know the other language, so I'm just not gonna worry about that too much. So let's take a look at the German version of Somewhere That's Green, because I think it's a really good example of how different translation methods can be applied to a single song. In English, it starts out with I know Seymour's the greatest, but I'm dating a semi-sadist. And in German, this is translated to Seymour ist idealistisch, doch mein Boyfriend ist halb sadistisch. It would seem weird to translate the English directly. For example, Ich weiß, Seymour ist der Größte. It just sounds awkward and doesn't really fit the melody as well. So the general idea is translated, Seymour is ideal. Meanwhile, the second half of the phrase is more literal, as the phrase semi-sadist is directly translated to halb sadistisch. And when the song goes into the dialogue, it also uses a mostly literal translation. Just a little street in a little suburb. Nur eine kleine Straße in einem kleinen Vorort. One of the most interesting changes is the I Love Lucy reference being entirely removed. We snuggle watching Lucy on our big enormous 12-inch screen becomes Sind wir damit beschäftigt, Satzgebäck vertilgend fern zu sehen. I assume this change was made because German audiences might know of I Love Lucy, but might not get that from someone just referencing Lucy, whereas in the US, the cultural context of it being set in the 60s hints at that more directly. But it's an interesting example of the text possibly being changed for cultural reasons. Even though it's a little different, I think the translation really retains the heart of the song. The ending lines, far from Skid Row, I dream we'll go, somewhere that's green, become weit von Skid Row, im grünen Wo, wir residieren. While working on this video, a friend gave me a book of journal entries from Candy Darling. Candy was a trans woman who lived in New York City in the mid-20th century, and despite having faced so much hardship, she had a wonderful acting career and lived her life unapologetically during a time when there were less resources for trans people than there are today. She's a true inspiration to me. At one point in the book, she talks about her aspirations for her transition. I still cannot decide about the nose job. The sex change and everything else, yes, yes, yes. If I'm going to be a woman, I want the whole thing. A home in the suburbs, a husband, and, strange as it may sound, children. Unfortunately, though, her life would be cut short and she would pass away at 29. But when reading this entry, I couldn't help but think about Audrey, wishing for a life that others might see as restrictive, trite, and plain. But to her, it means escape. It means a happy ending. Little Shop of Horrors is a musical that expresses just as many complicated emotions as it does simple ones. But at the center is a beautiful love story about two people wanting to escape their lives, who will do ultimately anything for each other, even if in the end it only causes them pain. And that reminds me of another part of Candy's journal, where she wrote down a quote from an episode of The Outer Limits, which paraphrased an old saying. "A grief shared is half a grief. A joy shared is twice a joy."